Welcome to Sleep for Stories. Thank you for joining us on this relaxing and mysterious journey. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future tales. Wishing you a peaceful listening experience and a restful sleep. It was a bitterly cold evening in late October when Amy and her younger brother Ben found themselves stranded on the side of the road. The sky above them had turned a deep, bruised purple, and the air had taken on a chilling, biting quality that sank into their bones. Their car had broken down just a few miles from the small town of Waverly, a quiet, seemingly ordinary place they had passed through countless times on their way to family visits. Amy had always found the towns unremarkable, until that night. It had all started earlier that afternoon. They were on their way to visit their grandparents, a routine journey they'd taken every year. The drive was long, but the familiar roads always made the trip feel manageable. But this time was different. The sun had dipped behind the horizon earlier than expected, and the weather had taken a turn for the worse. The temperature dropped, and with it, the warmth of the car, leaving Amy and Ben shivering in the cramped back seat. "I think the engine's dead," Amy muttered, turning the key in the ignition again. But the engine didn't respond. The dashboard lights flickered and then went dark. "Great, just great." Ben, ever the optimist, tried to reassure her. "It's probably just the battery. We can call someone, right?" Amy didn't respond immediately. Glancing out of the window, there was nothing around them except darkness and the occasional flicker of distant lights from houses scattered across the hills. They had just passed Waverly a few miles back, and Amy wasn't particularly keen on driving back through the small town, but the thought of sitting on the side of the road all night wasn't much better. "We'll have to walk," she said, finally deciding, "the town's not far. I'll call a tow truck when we get there." Ben reluctantly agreed, grabbing his jacket and following Amy as she led the way. The wind howled through the barren trees, their branches creaking ominously as they made their way along the road. The town of Waverly felt closer than it had before, its dim streetlights barely visible in the distance, like the eyes of a predator watching from the shadows. As they walked toward the town, Amy felt an odd unease. The town was supposed to be familiar, but tonight, something about it felt off. The air was unnaturally still, and the only sounds that reached her ears were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant howl of the wind. Ben kept close behind her, his steps quick and nervous. "Why does it feel so empty here?" he asked, his voice barely audible against the gusts of wind. Amy didn't have an answer. She had always known Waverly to be a sleepy town, but she had never seen it this quiet. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for Salcheres, whereas something to happen. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp crack, a sound from behind them. She whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was nothing. Only darkness. No footsteps, no one there. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ben nodded, his face pale. "I thought it was just me." Amy shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just the wind, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she quickened her pace, urging Ben to keep up. The closer they got to the town, the more the strange feeling in the air grew. The lights of the town flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. The streets were eerily empty, as if everyone had disappeared into thin air. They reached the main road of Waverly, and Amy paused at the corner, looking around. The houses on either side of the street were dark, the windows blackened with curtains, and there wasn't a single car parked along the road. Not even the sounds of dogs barking or children playing in the distance. I don't like this, Amy muttered. Where is everyone? Ben's eyes darted nervously from side to side. Maybe we should go to the gas station and call for help. Amy nodded. We'll call a tow truck and get out of here. They made their way down the main street toward the gas station, but as they passed by the old bakery, something caught Amy's eye. A figure standing in the doorway, just barely visible through the cracked window. It was an older man, his face obscured by shadows. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, unnaturally bright, like a wolf staring into the night. Amy froze, her breath catching in her throat. The man didn't move, didn't acknowledge them. He just stood there, staring at them through the glass. What's wrong? Ben asked, following her gaze. I don't know, Amy whispered. I don't think he's seen us. Ben tugged at her sleeve. We should go now. Amy nodded, but before they could move, the door to the bakery creaked open. The man stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. His face was still shadowed, but his presence was unmistakable. He seemed to loom over them, towering despite his frail appearance. Can I help you? His voice cracked, like dry leaves scraping across the ground. Amy felt a chill run down her spine. We're just passing through, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Our car broke down a few miles back. We were just going to call for help. The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving them. You're not from here, are you? He asked, his voice barely audible. No, Amy replied, her heart pounding. We're just passing through. We'll leave soon. The man took a step closer, and Amy instinctively stepped back, pulling Ben with her. You shouldn't be here. The man whispered, his voice low and urgent. No one who comes here ever leaves, not the way they came. Amy's heart skipped a beat, her blood running cold. What did he mean? She couldn't make sense of his words. She glanced around, but there was no one else in sight. Where are the others? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man's eyes flickered, and he turned his head slowly to the side, as though listening to something only he could hear. Then, with a final haunting glance, he turned and shuffled back into the bakery, disappearing into the shadows. Amy grabbed Ben's arm and pulled him down the street, her pulse racing. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she had to get out of this town. There was something wrong with Waverly. Something wrong with Waverly. Something ancient and twisted. As they passed the gas station, Amy's phone buzzed in her pocket. Relieved, she pulled it out, only to find that the call had gone through. The voice on the other end was faint, distorted, but familiar. Help is on the other. Help is on the voice said, but you need to leave. Now. Before she could respond, the call cut off. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shook with a low rumble, and a loud, guttural sound echoed from deep within the earth. The lights of deep within the earth gas station flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Amy felt the cold hands of fear clutch at her throat. We need to run, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ben nodded, and they ran, with nothing but the darkness and the eerie silence of Waverly surrounding them. But as they looked back, the bakery door opened once more, and the figure, the man with the glowing eyes, emerged from the shadows, and he was smiling. As Amy and Ben sprinted down the dark, desolate street, their footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness, Amy's mind raced. Her heart thudded in her chest, threatening to burst as she glanced over her shoulder. The figure, the man, was still standing at the bakery door, watching them. His smile now wider, more unsettling. The glow of his eyes seemed to intensify as they ran, like he was feeding off their fear, reveling in it. Ben tugged at Amy's arm, urging her to move faster. We have to get out of here. Where's the car? Amy's breath came in sharp gasps as she forced herself to keep running, but she didn't answer. Her mind was spinning. Why had he smiled like that? And why had he said no one ever leaves this place? What was the truth about Waverly? She knew they were getting closer to the edge of town, but the eerie silence was thick, suffocating. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of the night, crickets, distant animal calls, were absent. It felt as though the entire town were absent, holding its breath, waiting for something. Look, Ben shouted suddenly, pointing ahead. Amy followed his gaze and saw it. A faint light in the distance. The silhouette of their car sat beside the road, untouched and still, as though waiting for them. It was a small, fragile hope, but it was all waiting for them, all they had. Come on, Amy urged, pulling Ben forward. They were close now, just a few more steps, and they would be safe, or so she thought, as they approached the car. The sense of dread grew heavier, pressing against their chests. Amy glanced around, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. It was too quiet, too empty. And then, as they neared the car, the door creaked open on its own. Amy froze. Did you? She started, but Ben was already backing away, his eyes wide with fear. No, I didn't touch it, he cried. I swear I didn't. Amy's heart raced again, this time with terror. The light inside the car flickered once before dying. Completely. The interior was dark, but the faintest outline of something inside caught her eye. There, sitting in the front seat, was the man. He was no longer standing in the doorway of the bakery. He was here, sitting in their car, as if he had always been a part of it. The man's glowing eyes locked onto Amy's, and he leaned forward, his voice a low whisper that seemed to crawl into her mind. You can't leave, not without me. Amy took a step back, her legs trembling, but the car door swung open wider as if inviting her in. Ben tugged at her sleeve urgently. Amy, we need to go, now. But something inside her, some part of her mind, was urging her to approach the car, to listen to the man. It was as if the house, the town, everything had been leading up to this moment, pulling her in. The whispers were louder now, and the whispers were louder now, and they seemed to come from everywhere. The car, the street, the very air around them. The man's grin grew wider, his face stretching unnaturally, as if his skin was tearing, pulling away from his skull. He leaned even closer to the seat, his eyes glowing brighter, the light almost blinding. You belong to Waverly now, he whispered, his voice seeping into Amy's thoughts like cold water. And I've been waiting for you? No, Amy screamed, her voice ragged, breaking through the mental fog. She yanked Ben's arm harder and turned to run, but before they could take another step, the ground beneath their feet buckled. The street seemed to shift, the pavement cracking and groaning, the trees around them bending and twisting unnatural. The car's headlights flickered once more, casting long shadows across the road, and for a brief moment, Amy thought she saw something else. Figures moving in the dark, surrounding them, closing in. She spun around, only to find that the road was no longer the way it had been. The trees, the street, the houses, everything had changed. They weren't on the outskirts of town anymore. They were back in the center of town anymore. They were back in the center of Waverly, surrounded by the same dark streets, the same ominous buildings. The town had swallowed them whole. We're trapped, Ben whispered, his voice shaking. Amy's heart pounded in her chest as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. She could feel the house again, the presence she had felt earlier, that was now everywhere, inside her, surrounding her. It was alive. It was alive. It was awake. The man in the car didn't speak anymore. He didn't need to. His presence, his smile, was enough to make Amy feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her. They were never going to leave. heavy silence hung between them as the trees closed in, the whispers growing more frantic, more insistent. And then, from the darkness, another voice echoed through the air, a voice familiar but twisted. "Welcome home, Amy." The shadows began to move, swirling in on themselves. The town of Waverly was no longer a place, no longer a town. It was an entity, and it was hungry, and Amy, like all the others before her, was now part of it. Amy's vision blurred as the town closed in around them, its shadows darkening the streets, its walls pressing in like a giant hand. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, the whispers louder. Trees loomed over them, their twisted branches reaching out as though they were alive, hungry, waiting. The car was still there, its door wide open, and though she didn't want to look, she couldn't help herself. The man was gone, but his presence lingered. The glowing eyes were still burned into her memory, the coldness of his touch still fresh in her mind. She could feel the weight of his words. "You belong to Waverly now." He hadn't lied. She was part of the town now, but the true horror was yet to come. Amy took a hesitant step back, her legs trembling. She looked at Ben, who was standing motionless beside her, staring into the darkness as if he had been frozen in place. The only sounds around them were the whispers, voices so close now, so tangible, it felt like they were inside her skull. "Amy?" Ben whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "What is this place?" "I don't know," Amy replied, her voice barely audible. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." She turned her head, searching for some sign of escape. The road they had been walking down was no longer visible. It had disappeared into the dense fog which had now rolled in, swallowing everything in its path. The town seemed to have changed overnight, twisted, contorted into something else, something unrecognizable. The buildings loomed like twisted statues. Their windows loomed like twisted statues, their windows dark and lifeless. There was no movement, no sound, save for the unsettling whispers that filled the air, growing louder as they surrounded them. "We have to keep moving," Amy said, her voice shaking. She grabbed Ben's hand, pulling him toward what she hoped was the way out. But every step felt heavier, like the ground itself was trying to pull her back. The air was thick with an unnatural weight, pressing in on her chest, making it harder to breathe. Then, from somewhere, to breathe, deep in the town, a sound reached her ears. At first, it was distant, a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the ground. But as the seconds passed, the sound grew louder, closer. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the buildings her feet trembled, and the buildings around them seemed to shift. The air turned cold and damp, and she could smell something foul, decay, rot, something ancient and dead. "Do you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amy nodded. "Yes, we need to." But before she could finish her sentence, the town erupted into motion. The buildings shook violently, the streets cracking open like a yawning mouth. From the cracks, shadows began to crawl out, figures that were barely human, their forms twisted and contorted. They were not solid, but more like vapor, stretching and pulling at the air. Their eyes, those same glowing, soulless eyes, shone from these depths of the darkness. Amy's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. The shadows weren't just figures. They were souls, trapped, twisted beyond recognition, forced to wander the town forever. The people who had come before her, who had wandered into Waverly, just like she had. They hadn't escaped. They never would. "Amy," Ben shouted, his voice breaking her out of her daze. "We need to run, now!" But it was already too late. The shadows began to move toward them, closing in from all sides. The ground beneath their feet trembled, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. Amy tried to pull Ben, but he was frozen, staring at tide, the figures approaching. "I'm sorry," a voice whispered from behind them, so close it sent a shiver down Amy's spine. She spun around, but there was no one there, only darkness. And yet the voice, calm, almost soothing, had spoken directly to her. "You're not leaving, Amy?" "No one leaves." A shadow lunged at them, reaching out with cold, gnarled hands. Amy yanked Ben away, but the figure's touch was cold, freezing her skin. She screamed, and the sound of her voice echoed in the air, swallowed by the darkness. "We have to go. Now!" Amy cried, pulling Ben with all her strength. They turned and ran, but the shadows followed, relentless, closing in from all sides. The town had become a maze, a living nightmare. The streets twisted, the buildings shifted, and the whispers shifted, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent, until it felt like the very town was breathing down their necks. Amy's heart raced as she dragged Ben down an alley, her mind a blur of panic. They had to get out. They had to get out. They had to escape. But then they came to a stop. In front of them stood a door. The door, the one that had been at the end of the alley. It was large, imposing, and completely out of place. It wasn't part of the town, not part of the nightmare. The wood was old and splintered, but the door itself radiated an aura of power. Without thinking, Amy grabbed the handle and yanked it open. The door creaked as it swung wide, and a blinding light spilled out from the crack. The moment they crossed the threshold, the sounds of the town, the whispers, the shadows, the shaking ground, faded into silence for a split second. Amy thought they were free, but when she turned to look back at the door, it was gone. The light was gone. They were standing in an empty, dark field. Town, the shadows, the nightmare, all of it was gone. Ben stood beside her, his breathing heavy, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He gasped. Amy didn't answer at first. She didn't know. All she knew was that she had to leave before the darkness found them again. But then, just as they turned to walk, Amy felt something, a cold touch on her shoulder. She spun around, her heart pounding. The figure stood before her once more, its glowing eyes staring deep into her soul. "You can never escape." And with that, the darkness took her. Amy felt the cold fingers grip her shoulder, sending a chill straight to her shoulder, sending a chill straight to her spine. The world around her seemed to blur, as if reality itself were distorting. She tried to pull away, but the grip on her tightened. The shadows swirled around her, encircling her and Ben, cutting them off from the open field they had just entered. The figure, the one with the glowing eyes, moved closer, its form now clearer, but still shrouded in an unnatural fog. It was no longer just a shadow. It was solid, real, and its presence was suffocating. The air around Amy grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened as if the very atmosphere was being stolen from her. "You thought you escaped, didn't you?" The voice was distorted, as if coming from deep within the ground. It was both familiar and alien at once, like a forgotten memory clawing its way to the surface. "Who are you?" Amy gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper, fear choking her words. The figure took a slow step forward, its presence growing larger with each movement. It was tall, taller than any human should be, and its features were barely visible, lost in the deep shadows. Only the eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light, cold and relentless. "I am the keeper," the figure said, its voice sending shivers through Amy's body. "I keep what is lost. What belongs to the darkness? Amy's mind raced. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The fear was paralyzing, and every part of her screamed to get away from the figure, from the force that was now pressing down on her. But the darkness had already closed in now. The air was thick with it, the shadows pressing tighter against her skin, suffocating her. Ben, still by her side, was shaking, his eyes wide with terror. "What does it want with us?" he whispered, his voice quivering with fear. The keeper's glowing eyes locked onto Ben, and the smile that spread across its face was unnerving, twisted. "You were always meant to be part of it," the figure murmured. "You're already here, Innard, my domain. And once you're here, you never leave." Amy's heart slammed in her chest. She was stuck in a nightmare, trapped in a place that defied logic, where escape was an illusion. She looked around frantically, but all she could see was darkness. The light they had seen before was gone, swallowed by the endless black void. The figure in front of them began to reach out, its long fingers stretching toward them. But just as it was about to touch her, Amy snapped out of her. Frozen state. She grabbed Ben's hand, pulling him with all the strength she had left. "We need to move," she shouted. Without thinking, they ran, their footsteps pounding against the ground, echoing through the silence. The darkness around them seemed to stretch, twisting the world around them, but Amy refused to stop. They couldn't stop. Had to escape. The cold air bit at her skin, but she kept moving, pulling Ben behind her. But every time she looked back, the figure was still there, lurking in the shadows. Its glowing eyes never left them, watching their every move. "Cannot outrun me," the voice echoed, surrounding them, a low growl that rumbled through the ground. The world around them shifted again. The ground beneath their feet cracked, splitting open, swallowing the path they had just taken. Darkness spread, and the sky above them twisted, turning a deep, unnatural shade of purple. Amy stumbled, feeling the earth give way beneath her. She grabbed Ben, pulling him with her as they fell into the void, the ground crumbling beneath her as they fell into the void. Their feet. The fall felt endless, like they were plummeting into a bottomless abyss. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for impact. But there was no impact. Instead, she felt a sharp, sudden stop, as though she had slammed into something invisible. The sensation of falling stopped, and she opened her eyes to find herself in a new place, a place that wasn't the forest or the field or the house she had been in before. They were in a dark, decrepit room. The walls covered in a dark, decrepit room. The walls covered in a thick, cracked stone. There was no light here, only shadows stretching and shifting around them, moving in unnatural patterns. The air was thick, oppressive, and the faintest whispers could be heard from all directions, murmuring words that didn't make sense. Ben was beside her, looking just as confused and terrified. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice shaking before Amy could respond. She heard it, the whisper, the low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "You've entered the place of no return." Amy felt a chill crawl up her spine. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadows around them seemed to move, crawling up the walls, across the ceiling, and down to the floor, where they began to pool around them like a growing tide. "We need to get out of here," Amy muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. But the more she tried to move, the more the darkness seemed to pull her back, trapping her. It was as though the very air had turned to lead, the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, making every step a struggle. And then, just as the shadows seemed to close in around them, the figure appeared again. It was standing in front of them, its glowing eyes now burning with an intense, unholy light. The smile on its face was wide, too wide, and its teeth gleamed in the darkness. "You belong to me now," it said softly, its voice sweet like poison. "There is no escape from this place." Amy's body froze. The figure wasn't just a threat. It was a part of the very darkness that had consumed her. It was the keeper of this place, the one who had waited for her, for Ben. And now there was no way out. She looked at Ben, and for the first time, she felt an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. They had nowhere to go. The house, they had nowhere to go. Shadows, the figure. It was all a trap they couldn't escape from. The figure took a step toward them, and the shadows seemed to pulse with its every movement. The walls of the room began to close in, the air growing heavier, darkness becoming suffocating. And then it spoke again, its voice low and haunting. "You are mine, now, forever." The walls closed in around them, and the last thing Amy felt was the cold hand of the figure on her arm, pulling her into the thick abyss. The suffocating darkness closed in around Amy and Ben, their hearts pounding in their chests as the walls seemed to shrink, pushing them together, closing the space until they were almost breathing the same air. The cold touch of the all-fair figure on Amy's arm sent a jolt of panic through her body, her pulse racing as if it could escape her chest. The figure loomed over them, its glowing eyes the only source of light in the endless blackness. Its smile stretched wider, the edges of files stretched wider, the edges of its lips pulling back unnaturally, revealing rows of jagged yellowed teeth. It felt like the entire room was watching them, waiting, as though it had been anticipating their arrival for far longer than they had ever known. "There is no escape from this place," the figure whispered, its voice echoing around them, its words wrapping around their minds like tendrils, suffocating them with its weight. Amy fought against the grip on her arm, her mind racing. She had to think. She had to let her own racing to do something, but every movement felt slow, like wading through deep water. The darkness around her seemed to press against her skin, pushing her down into the cold, inescapable depth. Ben, still beside her, trembled violently. His face faced her, trembled violently, his face pale with fear. "Amy, what is this? What is this place?" Amy couldn't answer. The figure's presence was suffocating, and the air around them felt thick, oppressive. She turned her head slightly, but she couldn't see anything except the figure. No escape, no other place to run. "There is no place to run. There is no place to hide," the figure said, as though reading her thoughts. "This house, this town, it's all mine, and you will never leave." Amy's heart raced as the figure took another step forward. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made hers skin crawl. Every part of her screamed to run, to escape, but the shadows kept them rooted to the spot, like invisible chains wrapping around her limbs, binding her in place. And then, as the figure raised its hand, the air around them shifted. The walls seemed to pulse, and the shadows that had been surrounding them began to form shapes. Dark, formless figures that writhed and swirled around them like serpents in the night. They weren't real in any tangible way, but they were real in any tangible way. There, pressing in, their shapes shifting, constantly moving. "You will never leave, Amy," the figure whispered, its voice now louder, more insistent. "You are one with this place now, one with the darkness." Suddenly, Amy's eyes widened, and a thought pierced through the haze of fear. She didn't have to fight this alone. She wasn't the only one trapped here. Ben was with her. She grabbed his hand tightly. her grip firm despite the coldness creeping up her arm from the figure's touch. "Ben," she whispered urgently. "We can't give up. We need to find a way out." Ben's eyes were wide, his body trembling as the weight of the situation settled over him, but his voice came out clear, despite the fear. "I'm with voice," came out clear, despite the fear. "You, Amy, I'm not leaving you. We'll find a way." Their hands were still clasped together, the warmth of Ben's touch pulling Amy back from the brink of despair. The darkness around them pressed closer, suffocating, but she refused to give in. The figure watched them silently, its eyes narrowing as it saw their resolve. But then, something shifted. The air around them grew colder, frigid, in fact, as if the very essence of life was being drained from the room. The shadows writhed around them like a living thing, their movement erratic and desperate. The walls groaned, and the figure's smile faltered. For a split second, its once confident stance wavered. Amy's heart beat faster. Was this the weakness? Was the house, this thing, afraid? "Ben," Amy said, her voice stronger now, her determination returning. "We can beat this. We can break free." With the last ounce of her strength, she pulled Ben forward. She felt the darkness tug at her, trying to drag her back into its grasp, but she fought against it, her feet steady on the ground. The figure stepped forward again, its glowing eyes now burning brighter than ever. "You cannot fight me." But Amy didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The walls, the shadows, the figure. They were all part of this place, this nightmare. But so was she. She had entered Waverly, walked into its darkness, and now she was the one who could choose. With Ben by her side, they pushed forward, taking each step despite the suffocating presence that pressed in from all sides. Suddenly, a deep rumble filled the room, louder than anything they'd heard before. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the shadows recoiled. It felt as though the entire room was shaking. No, not just the room, the entire house. The air grew thin, the walls cracking and splitting open, revealing a blinding light from within. The figure let out a low, guttural hiss. Its form flickered, its once solid shape now writhing, distorting. The glow from its eyes dimmed, flickering like a dying flame. "No," it hissed. "You cannot escape." But Amy didn't falter. She took Ben's hand, and they ran. They ran through the darkness, through the cracks in the walls, through the twisting corridors, until the light from within the house grew brighter and brighter, illuminating everything in its path. The figure's voice echoed behind them, fading, losing its power. "You cannot." And then there was silence. The house, once alive with darkness, seemed to collapse in on itself. The whispers were gone. The shadows gone. The shadows gone. The whispers were weight that had pressed on their chests, gone. The air was still and pure, the light surrounding them warm and peaceful. The road ahead was clear, and the only sound was their breathing, ragged and full of relief. Amy and Ben looked at each other, their eyes wide with disbelief. They were standing on a road, bathed in the soft light of the early morning sun. The town of Waverly was behind them, distant now, nothing more than a memory. The air was cool, but not cold. And there was cool, and not cold, was no longer any sign of the oppressive, suffocating darkness that had held them captive. It was over, but as they looked back one last time, they saw something, a shadow in the distance, a figure, standing alone at the edge of the town, watching them, and in its eyes, a faint glow. Amy and Ben stood frozen for a moment, their breath caught in their throats. The shadow in the distance was too familiar, too ominous. It was standing just outside the town, a silhouette outside the town, a silhouette against the fading light, watching them with eyes that seemed to pierce through the distance. The faint glow in its eyes flickered like a dying star, almost too far to see, but Amy could feel its presence, just as she had felt it before. The figure was not gone. It was still here. "Do you see that?" Ben whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible. He was gripping her arm tightly, his knuckles white with fear. Amy didn't answer at first. She was still trying to process everything that had just happened. The house, Waverly, had felt like a nightmare, but now that they were free, it was as if the nightmare was still lingering, like a ghost that refused to let them go. "I see it," she whispered back. Her pulse was racing. The air around them felt thick again, like the shadows had followed them, inching closer with every passing second. The figure in the distance remained still, like it was waiting, watching, but Amy knew that it wasn't just standing there. It was waiting for something. It was waiting for them to make the next move. "Let's go," she said, her voice steadying, though her heart still hammered in her chest. "We can't just stand here." But as they started to move, taking tentative steps toward the safety of the road, the ground beneath them trembled again. A low rumble shook the earth, like a distant earthquake, making the ground feel unstable, unpredictable. Amy stumbled, grabbing onto Ben for support. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice strained with fear. The rumble continued, and the light around them seemed to dim, the warmth of the morning sun vanishing as if it were being swallowed by something far darker. "Where is the light?" Ben asked, his eyes darting around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The world around them was suddenly cold, the warmth of freedom slipping away. It was as though they had crossed some invisible line, and now they were back in thieves or crossed some invisible line. And now they were back in the grasp of the very thing they thought they had escaped. The shadow in the distance began to move, slowly, purposefully, its form shifting and bending in a way that wasn't quite natural. It seemed to glide toward them, its movements too smooth. Too calculated. The glow in its eyes brightened with each step. "Why is it following us?" Amy gasped. She could feel the presence again, the same weight pressing against her chest, the same suffocating sensation. It was the same house, the same place, but in a different form. It wasn't bound to the walls anymore. It was everywhere. Had followed them. Ben's hand tightened around hers. "We have to get away. We can't stay here." But Amy knew they couldn't outrun what had followed them. They could feel it now, crawling under their skin, whispering in their ears, pulling them toward the shadows. The very land beneath them felt as if it was alive, like it was trying to drag them back. And then it happened. Without warning, the ground in front of them split open, a great chasm forming right where they had been, standing only moments before. A deep, inky blackness poured from the crack in the earth, an endless void that seemed to pull everything toward it. The air shifted, becoming heavy with the scent of decay and rot, and Amy stumbled backward, pulling Ben with her. "Run!" she shouted, her voice desperate, filled with terror. They turned and ran, the world around them shifting, warping, as though the very ground beneath them was rejecting their existence. The trees, once familiar, now seemed to stretch their existence. The trees, once familiar, now seemed to stretch their branches toward them like skeletal hands, reaching, clawing for them, wanting to pull them into the darkness. The road ahead seemed to stretch out endlessly, never ending, and the farther they ran, the darker it became. But no matter how fast they ran, the shadows followed, whispering, twisting around them, clinging to their legs, trying to trip them up. Amy's heart pounded in her chest as she forced her legs to move faster, ignoring the cold that seemed to crawl into her bones. With every step, Ben was beside her, his breath ragged, but they kept running. There was no other choice. The light they had hoped for, the safety they had yearned for, was fading. The shadow, that figure was coming closer. Suddenly, they reached a clearing in the woods, a large, open area, surrounded by trees. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone archway, ancient and weathered, its surface covered in vines and moss. It seemed to shimmer, faintly, like something between worlds. The air around it felt different, as if the very essence of reality was warping. Amy stopped, staring at the archway. What is this place? Ben took a step back, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. I don't know, no, but we can't go any further. It's like it's not real. It feels wrong. But Amy felt the pull. It wasn't just a feeling. She could sense the archway. She could sense the archway, calling to her, beckoning her closer, as though it had always been there, waiting for her. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Ben, we have to go through, she said, her voice steady but filled with fear. We have no other choice. We have no other choice, hesitated, looking from her to the archway, and then back at the approaching shadow. The figure, now much closer, was almost upon them. Its eyes glowed brighter, and its shape was becoming clearer. Tall and towering, like a giant with long, with twisted limbs and a face that shifted with every glance. It was getting closer. Too close now. Please, Amy, Ben cried out, fear raw in his voice. I don't want to go in there. But Amy knew they had no choice. The figure was closing in, its presence suffocating. She grabbed Ben's hand and pulled him toward the archway. As they stepped through, the world around them shifted again. Everything went dark. The cold hit them like a wave. The ground beneath them was gone, and they were falling through an endless black void. And then the whispers stopped. As Amy and Ben plummeted through the endless void, their minds screamed for the fall to stop, but the darkness swallowed them whole. As though time itself had ceased to exist, their bodies seemed to stretch out of shape, the sensation of falling endless, and the only sound was the rushing wind tearing through their ears. It felt as though they had fallen for years, or maybe it was only moments. There was no way to tell. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fall stopped. They hit solid ground with a jarring thud. Amy gasped, feeling the breath knocked out of her, but she quickly pushed herself up, her hands digging into the hard, cold surface beneath her. The cold was biting, sharper than anything she'd felt before, and the air was stale, like it had been trapped in a sealed room for centuries. She turned to Ben, who was gasping beside her. He was trembling, his eyes wide with terror, but he was alive. Amy, what is this place? He whispered, his voice barely audible in the suffocating silence that surrounded them. Amy stood, her legs shaky as she looked around. The landscape they had landed in was unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't the forest, nor was it the town they had just fled from. The ground beneath them was black, as if scorched by fire, and the sky above was an unnatural shade of red. It felt like a place where the laws of nature didn't apply, where time itself bent and warped, was thick, filled with a heavy, oppressive weight that made it difficult to breathe. It felt as though they were standing in the heart of something ancient, something forgotten by the world. The whispers, those cold, unsettling voices, were gone. There was no sound, no movement, only the sense that something was watching them. Ben turned to Amy, his face pale with fear. We need to get out of here, he said, his voice tight with panic. Amy nodded, but she felt a strange sensation in her chest, a pull toward the center of the vast expanse around them. It was as if something was calling to her, guiding her, though she couldn't explain why. "We have to move," she said, more to herself than to Ben. "We have to herself than to Ben? We have to find out where we are." They took a tentative step forward, but the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, as though the very earth was alive. It was subtle at first, just a slight tremor, but it was enough to send a chill down Amy's spine. The ground groaned and cracked beneath them, and she felt her stomach lurch with unease. And then, without warning, a voice echoed across the space. It was low, deep, and it vibrated through the very air, sending waves of cold through the very air. Sending waves of cold through their bodies. "You shouldn't have come here." Amy froze, the words wrapping around her like icy chains. She turned to Ben, but he was already looking around frantically, his face filled with terror. The voice had come from nowhere and everywhere all at once, as though it had seeped from the very ground beneath them. The voice came again, this time with a sharp, painful clarity. "You are where you belong." The ground beneath their feet began to tremble once more, stronger this time, and the sky above them seemed to flicker. The red hue darkened, swirling into deeper shades of crimson and black, until it felt as though the entire world was closing in around them. Amy grabbed Ben's arm. "We need to run." "Ben, now." But as they turned to flee, the ground cracked open before them, revealing a deep chasm that seemed to stretch into infinity. The air around them grew colder, and the whispers, the ones that had been silent for so long, began to return, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. "You can't escape. You are already one of us." Amy's heart raced as the abyss before them seemed to widen. She could feel the pull, the same pull that had drawn her to the archway in the first place. Something was waiting for them, something ancient, something dark. She turned to look at Ben, but he wasn't there anymore. Her blood ran cold. "Ben!" she cried out, her voice panicked. She searched frantically, but Ben had vanished. The space around her had changed again. The shadows seemed to writhe, and the red sky above her seemed to grow darker with each passing second. She could feel darker with each passing second. She could feel the presence of something in the distance, something far more terrifying than the house, than the figure that had followed them. It was ancient, primordial, and it was closing in on her. Suddenly, the voice returned. This time, it was returned. This time, it was returned. Louder, more distinct. "You're too late. The darkness has already claimed you." Amy's chest tightened. She could feel it now. Feel the very essence of the place. Its hunger. Its endless desire for souls. She had thought she had escaped. But she was wrong. She hadn't run far enough. There was no escaping this place. There never was. And then, the ground beneath her feet shifted once more, but this time it didn't crack. It collapsed. Amy's body lurched as she was sucked into the chasm. Her scream echoed, but the sound was swallowed by the infinite darkness. She fell, faster and faster, deeper into the abyss, the air growing colder, her heart racing in her chest. For a moment, there was only darkness, and then there was only darkness. And then, just as she thought she would never stop falling, she landed. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and Amy gasped for air. She scrambled to her feet, but as she did, she realized with a sickening dread that she wasn't alone. Around her were others, figures, shadows, faces that were barely human, their eyes glowing like the figures from before. They were all around her, their movements slow and deliberate. The air was thick with their presence, and the whispers flooded her mind once more. "You are one of us now." Amy looked around, panic rising in her chest. She had seen these faces before, the ones trapped in the house, the ones who had never escaped. And now, she was one of them. The darkness closed in around her, and the last thing Amy saw was the figure, standing in the distance, watching her with its glowing eyes. The smile on its face stretched impossibly wide, and she realized she would never escape. This was her new home, her prison, and she was never leaving. The darkness around Amy seemed to grow, suffocating her every breath as she looked at the figures surrounding her. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their gaze pressing down on her shoulders, heavy and unyielding. The whispers intensified, voices overlapping, coming from every direction, filling her head with madness. They were all trapped here, just like her, lost souls, their faces twisted with fear, their bodies mere shadows of what they had once been. But despite the overwhelming sense of dread that clawed at her mind, Amy didn't give in. She couldn't. She had fought to escape once, and she would fight again, even if it seemed hopeless, even if it seemed hopeless, even if every part of her screamed that there was no way out. She refused to accept this as her fate. "You can't escape," the voice echoed around her once more, deep and resonant, vibrating through the air. The figure, now closer than ever, stepped forward, its glowing eyes locking onto hers, burning with an unnatural intensity. "You belong here now." Amy shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. She backed away, stumbling over the uneven ground, but the shadows followed, closing in on her. There was nowhere to run, no place to hide. The very air around her seemed to pulse with the presence of the house, the town, the thing that had claimed her. It had consumed everything, her past, her hope, her sense of reality. But still, she fought. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble again, and the walls of the cavernous space surrounding her seemed to shift. The shadows twisted, their forms growing longer, stretching toward her like dark skeletal hands. The temperature dropped rapidly, frost creeping across the stone floor, and Amy felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The cold was unbearable, seeping deep into her bones, as though it was trying to freeze her from the inside out. "You cannot leave," the voice whispered again, softer this time, almost coaxing. "You never caught." Amy's eyes darted around, searching for a way out, but there was nothing. The darkness surrounded her like a living entity, closing in tighter with each passing second. The figures in shadows stepped closer, their faces now fully visible, their eyes vacant and soulless. They were nothing but husks, trapped here by the very thing that held her prisoner. And then, as she felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on her, something unexpected happened. A sharp, bright light cut through the shadows, illuminating the space around her like a beam from the heavens. It wasn't the pale, ghostly light that had flickered before. This light was strong, pure, and blinding, cutting through the suffocating darkness with a force that made her heart skip a beat. For a moment, everything stood still. The figures in the shadows froze, their forms flickering like shadows in the light, unable to move. Amai squinted against the brightness, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then, through the light, she saw something. Someone. A figure stood at the edge of the cavern, just outside the circle of darkness, their face obscured by Thesa, blinding light. It was a person, tall and cloaked in a flowing robe. They didn't move, but the air around them felt different, lighter, almost familiar. "Who are you?" Amy called out, her voice desperate. She didn't care who it was, as long as they could help her escape. The figure didn't respond, but they raised their hand, as if beckoning her toward them. The shadows seemed to recoil from the light, fading into the walls, as if they were retreating from this force that had come to challenge them. Amy hesitated for a moment, fear gripping her heart. But the figure's presence was undeniable. It felt safe. It felt like something she could trust, something that had come to free her. Without thinking, she took a step toward the light, and as she did, the darkness around her seemed to fight back, surging forward, trying to reclaim her. But the light pushed it back, pushing forward, trying to reclaim her, the shadows into the corners of the space, weakening them. Step by step, Amy moved closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the presence of the figure, could feel their gaze, though she still couldn't make out their features. It was as if they were guiding her, pulling her closer to freedom. The closer she got, the more the shadows seemed to retreat, until finally, she reached the edge of the light. The moment she crossed the threshold, the darkness screamed. Sound was deafening, like thousands of voices wailing in agony. The walls of the cavern cracked and splintered, as if the very foundation of the place was being torn apart. Amy took another step forward, and the world shifted. The light shifted, surrounded her, engulfing her entirely, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to vanish. She felt weightless, as if she were floating in a void, her body suspended between worlds. But there was no fear now, only a strange sense of peace. Ah, peace she hadn't felt since before everything had started, before the house, before the town. And then, in the blink of an eye, the light disappeared. Amy gasped, her body crashing onto the cold, hard ground. She looked up, blinking as sudden darkness engulfed her again, but this time it was different. The air was no longer suffocating. The oppressive weight had lifted, and the shadows around her no longer whispered or clawed at her skin. She was back in the world she had known. She stood slowly, her limbs trembling with exhaustion, but her heart was no longer weighed down by the terror she had felt before. The nightmare was over, for now, but even as she stood in the quiet, abandoned town, she felt the abandoned town? She felt the familiar, cold touch of the air against her skin. The shadows still lingered, somewhere, just out of sight, waiting, watching. Amy didn't look back. She couldn't, but as she walked away from the town of Waverly, she knew one thing for certain. She had escaped, but she wasn't sure for how long. The darkness had never truly let her go, and it never would. Amy walked through the town, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. She didn't look back, but the feeling of being watched never left her. The light she had seen had saved her, but now, as she moved farther from the place, there was a cold certainty that the darkness was still lingering, just beyond her reach. It had only been pushed back, not destroyed. The houses around her were empty, their windows dark and vacant. The streets that once seemed so familiar to her now appeared foreign, alien even. The warmth of the morning sun had returned, but it felt like it was barely enough to fight off the suffocating cold that had settled in her bones. The deeper she went into the town, the more she felt like the walls themselves were closing in on her. Her thoughts kept circling back to the figure, the one who had appeared in the light. It had been so different from the darkness that had chased her, so pure, but it hadn't said a word. It had only gestured toward the light, silently guiding her away from the shadows. Amy glanced over at Ben, who had been walking a few steps behind her. His face was pale, his eyes wide, as if he were still processing everything that had happened. His hands were trembling at his sides, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he expected the darkness to come rushing back at any moment. "Are you okay?" Amy asked quietly, her voice soft, almost unsure. Ben nodded slowly, though his gaze never left the path behind them. I We're still being watched. Amy nodded in agreement. She felt it too. The eerie quiet that seemed to stretch endlessly. The way every street and every house felt. Wrong. They were free, but only in the physical sense. The darkness was still sense. The darkness was still there, lingering just beyond their reach. And something deep in her gut told her it was only waiting for the right moment to strike again. She glanced back toward the heart of the town, the place where she had fought so hard to escape. The houses were still there, but they seemed distant now, no longer a place of refuge, but something she couldn't ever return to. The dark figure in the car, the man with the glowing eyes, those memories were fading, but they hadn't disappeared. They were stitched into her very being, wrapped up in the fabric of the nightmare that had never truly ended. "We have to leave here," Amy said, her voice shaking slightly. "We have to get out of this town, away from everything." Ben looked at out of this town, away from everything. His face serious. Do you think we can escape it, Amy? The house, the shadows, everything." Amy hesitated, not knowing how to answer. The feeling of the house, the way it had pulled her in, was something she could never forget. It had been more than a building. It had been an entity, a living thing that had taken hold of her, manipulated her, twisted her mind into believing there was no escape. And the figure, that strange being that had appeared in the light, who was it really? Was it a part of the same dark force, or had it been trying to help her? She couldn't tell anymore. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know one thing. We can't stay here. We have to keep moving." Ben nodded slowly, though his eyes betrayed his fear. "Where do we go? Where can we go that's safe?" Amy looked down the street. The town felt like a dead world now, frozen in time. The houses were silent, the air thick with the weight of secrets. There was nowhere to run, nowhere that could truly protect them. "Maybe we don't need to run anymore," Amy said, a thought forming in her mind. Maybe the answer isn't about getting away, but about confronting it, facing the darkness head on. Ben's eyes widened with uncertainty. "You're not serious, are you? After everything we've been through, you want to go back? We barely made it out alive." Amy didn't know if it was the right decision, but something inside her told her that this was the only way to truly be free. The darkness, whatever it was, had followed them, but they had no idea how far its reach really went. If they kept running, they would always be looking over their shoulders, haunted by the fear that it would catch up to them. "What if it's not about running anymore?" Amy whispered to herself. "What if it's about ending it once and for all?" Ben was silent for a long time. He looked at the town behind them, and then at Amy. His face showed his fear, but also a glimmer of determination. He nodded slowly. "I'm with you. I don't know what we're going to find when we go back, but I won't leave you to face this alone." Amy felt a surge of gratitude and strength fill her. She knew what they were up against, and she wasn't sure what awaited them when they returned. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever the house was, whatever it had become, it wasn't going to win. Not this time. "Then we go," she said, her voice steady now. "We go back to the heart of it, to the place where it all began." The decision was made. The town, with its shadows and its shadows and its shadows and its shadows, whispers, was not the place of their escape. It was the place of their final confrontation. Amy and Ben turned back toward the heart of Waverly, their footsteps echoing on the empty street. The whispers that had followed them now seemed to be calling out, urging them toward the inevitable. But this time, they weren't running away. This time, they would face it head on, and the darkness would have to answer for what it had done. Amy and Ben moved through the streets of Waverly with a new resolve. The air felt different now, no longer cold and suffocating, but heavy with anticipation. The shadows that once loomed ominously now seemed to retreat, as if they were afraid to confront the strength that had been awakened in them. The road ahead felt familiar yet alien, as if the town had shifted in subtle ways. The buildings that lined the streets were the same, but something about them felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in on them. And even the windows, which had once been dark and lifeless, now glinted with an eerie light, as though the town was alive, watching them, waiting for them to return. "What if we're making a mistake?" Ben asked, his voice low but filled with uncertainty. "What if going back is just a trap? What if we're walking right into it?" Amy looked at him, her heart heavy, but her mind focused. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't even know if they could defeat whatever force held Waverly in its grip. But one thing was clear. Running had never worked. She and Ben had been running from the darkness for too long. It was time to stop running. "I don't know if we can defeat it," Amy said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "But I know we can't live like this anymore. We can't keep running, Ben. We have to face it." Ben looked at her, his expression filled with fear and doubt. But beneath that, there was something else. Understanding, a shared recognition that they had no other choice. "I'm with you," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "I'll go wherever you go. Together." They turned back toward the heart of Waverly, the place where everything had begun, the place where the house stood, the place where the darkness had first consumed them. As they walked, the silence around them grew thicker. It was as if the town itself had quieted, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The occasional creak of the wind through the trees was the only sound that broke the stillness, and even that seemed muffled, like the very air was holding back a scream. They finally reached the house. It loomed before them, taller and darker than they remembered. The windows were black, like empty eyes staring out from the walls. The door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting them inside. Amy's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't stop. She took a deep breath, pushing the fear aside, and stepped forward. Ben followed closely behind her, his footsteps echoing in the silence as they approached the door. Amy hesitated for just a moment. The last time she had stepped inside this house, it had nearly consumed her. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't running. She was going to confront the darkness. She pushed the door open. The air inside was thick and musty, the smell of decay filling her nostrils. The house felt alive. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The shadows inside shifted, moving like liquid in the corners of her vision, and she could feel the weight of them, like they were pressing against her skin. "We're here," she whispered to herself, though the words felt more like a mantra than anything else. She had to believe that facing the darkness would set them free. The moment they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Amy jumped, her heart skipping a beat, but she didn't turn around. She kept her focus forward, her eyes locked on the hallway ahead. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the house. The walls felt closer now, the space smaller, as though the house was squeezing them in, trapping them. The whispers from before began to return, faint at first, but growing louder with each step they took. They were like voices from another time, voices that had been trapped in the house, waiting for someone to undo us. "Our Turk, she is traumatized." Listen. Suddenly, Amy stopped. She felt it, an overwhelming presence in the room, something alive in the darkness. She could feel it moving around them, pressing in, watching them from every angle. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the depths of the house, followed by a voice, one she knew all too well. "You shouldn't have come back." Amy turned. her heart racing. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was the figure. The same dark figure that had haunted her before. It's the dark figure that had haunted her before. Its glowing eyes piercing through the shadows. Its smile was wide, too wide, its teeth sharp and yellowed. "You cannot defeat me," the figure said, its voice dripping with malice. "You are mine now, forever." Amy stood her ground. "No," she stood her ground. "No," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "We're not yours. We're not anyone's." The figure took a step forward, its form shifting and flickering, becoming more and more monstrous with every movement. Its face twisted, becoming more and more monstrous with every movement. Something less human, something more primal, and the air grew thick with its presence. It was almost as if the darkness itself had come alive, embodied in this one creature. Amy took a deep breath, steeling herself. This wasn't the time to back down. This was the moment she had been preparing for. The moment when she would face the thing that had been chasing her for so long. "We're leaving," Amy said, her voice firm. The figure snarled, its eyes flashing brighter. "You can't leave," it growled. "This is where you belong." Amy's eyes narrowed. Not anymore. With a sudden burst of strength, she stepped forward, pulling Ben with her. They charged toward the figure, pushing through the weight of the darkness, ignoring the overwhelming fear that threatened to drown them. The air around them seemed to ripple as they moved, the shadows retreating for just a moment. And then, Amy did something she never thought she would. She reached out, touching Thea, darkness itself, her fingers brushing against the cold, writhing energy that had trapped them. And something shifted. The figure let out a horrible, bone-chilling scream, its form flickering violently. The house trembled as the walls cracked, the shadows twisting and warping as though the entire structure was collapsing in on itself. The air grew thick, like it was about to suffocate them, but Amy kept pushing forward. Ben was right behind her, and together they fought against the ether, darkness, pushing through the waves of fear, moving toward the light at the end of the hallway. And then, with one final push, they broke free. The house collapsed around them, the darkness receding as if it had never been there. The air was receding as if it had never been there, suddenly fresh again, and the oppressive weight lifted from their shoulders. They were outside now, standing in the cold night air, the town of Waverly far behind them. Amy gasped for breath, her legs trembling beneath her. Ben stood beside her, staring at the ruins of the house as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. They had made it out, but as they turned to walk away, Amy felt a shiver run down her spine. There was still something watching them. The darkness hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting, and it would be back. Amy's heart continued to race as she and Ben walked further away from the crumbled house. The eerie silence that had enveloped Waverly seemed to press against her ears, suffocating her, even though the town was now behind them. The further they got, the more she could feel the presence of something, the darkness, lingering just beyond their perception, watching them, waiting for its moment. She glanced at Ben, who walked beside her, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Amy could feel the fear radiating from him, the same fear that burned inside her. The house, the darkness, the shadows. They were still a part of them. It was as if a part of them, hadn't escaped at all. The suffocating weight of the place lingered in the air, even in the quiet solitude of the night. "We're out," Ben said quietly, his voice shaky, but with an edge of disbelief. "We made it out." Amy didn't respond. Immediately, she couldn't bring herself to say the words. It didn't feel like escape, not yet. She had felt the figure's presence again before they left the house, felt its cold, dead grip tightening around her heart. "Are we really out?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's not over? What if we just walked right into another trap? Ben's eyes flickered to hers, his face pale and drawn. I don't know, Amy, but we can't keep running forever. Amy clenched her fists at her sides, fighting the sudden surge of fear. I know, I just would be over, that the house would be behind us. But I don't feel free, not yet. Ben stayed silent, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. His expression was hard, but there was something in his gaze that made Amy wonder if he shared her fear, that the darkness was not something they could simply escape. No matter how far they ran, it was always going to be with them, lingering in the shadows of their minds, waiting for the right moment to return. They reached the edge of town. But even then, the sense of dread didn't lift. There were no sounds, no movement. The world seemed still, frozen in time. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows across the empty road, and the trees along the roadside swayed in the breeze, their bare branches creaking like old bones. I don't understand, Amy murmured, her voice barely audible. Why us? Why did the darkness choose us? Ben stopped walking, and for the first time, he looked at her directly, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. I think we were always meant to be part of it. The town. It wasn't just a place. It was like a living thing, and we were connected to it. Maybe we still are. Amy felt a shiver run down her spine at his words. What did that mean? Were they still part of the town? Were they still a part of the darkness that had consumed Waverly? Before she could respond, she heard something, a faint sound in the distance. It was barely perceptible, but it sent a chill through her. It was a whisper, like a rustling wind, but unmistakably human. She froze, her body tense with awe. Alarm. Ben must have heard it too, because he immediately turned to look at her, his expression changing from worry to fear. It's here, he said, his voice trembling. It's following us? Amy's breath caught in her throat. The whispering sound grew louder now, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but the words, just barely, were clear. You can't escape. Amy spun around, her eyes scanning the empty road, but there was nothing there. No figures, no shapes moving in the empty road, but there was nothing there. Distance. Just the cold, dead air stretching out endlessly in front of them. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, swirling around her, echoing in her mind. You will never be free. Ben grabbed her arm. His grip tight. We grabbed her arm. His grip tight. To go, now. But the darkness seemed to close in, thickening around them, the whispers crawling up their backs, the ground beneath their feet vibrating with an unnatural hum. The air was thick and oppressive, and the world around them was beginning to warp. Amy's pulse quickened. The town wasn't behind them anymore. It was ahead of them. It was everywhere. We have to keep moving, Amy whispered to herself, the words feeling like a mantra as she forced herself to walk forward. As they continued down the road, the sky above them seemed to pulse, the color of the moon shifting from a pale, sickly white to a deep, blood-red hue. The land itself felt alive, as if it were shifting beneath their feet, bending the very fabric of reality to its will. Amy could feel it now, the pull of the town, the pull of the darkness. It was stronger than ever, pulling at her soul, tempting her to look back, to go back. She fought it, her steps faltering, but she kept going. Ben was right beside her, but she could tell that he was feeling it too, the same weight pressing down on them, suffocating them with the same coldness that had held them captive in the house. And then, as if the world itself had had enough of their resistance, a voice spoke, clear and loud in the empty air. You can never leave. Amy stopped dead in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. It was that voice again, that same haunting, unnatural tone, the one that had echoed in the house, the one that had made her blood run cold. Before she could react, the ground beneath them shook violently, the earth cracking wide open, the road splintered, splitting like a wound that wouldn't heal. The sky darkened even further, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a banshee. Ben screamed, pulling Amy with him as the ground crumbled beneath their feet. The darkness rose from the cracks, swirling in the air like a living entity, reaching for them with long, skeletal hands. Amy's heart raced as she and Ben stumbled, struggling to keep their footing on the shifting ground. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And then, through the chaos and the terror, Amy heard the final whisper, as clear as the wind itself. You will always be mine. And in that moment, Amy understood. No matter how far they ran, no matter what they did, Waverly and everything in it would always be with them. The darkness didn't just inhabit the town. It had marked them. It had claimed them. And now they were part of it, just as it had always wanted. Amy felt the world around her crumbling, and her heart raced as the ground shook beneath her feet. The darkness closed in from all sides, swallowing everything in its path, twisting the reality she had known. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of terror. "You are mine," the voice repeated, as though it was speaking directly into her mind, twisting her thoughts. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It was part of her very being. The earth trembled violently again, and Amy stumbled, nearly losing her footing as the ground cracked open wider. Ben gripped open wider, her arm pulling her toward him as they tried to regain their balance. But the darkness didn't let up. It pressed in on them from all directions, suffocating, closing them in like an invisible cage. "We need to get out of here," Ben gasped, his voice raw with panic. His grip on her arm was tight, desperate. But Amy didn't know where to go. The road had disappeared, and the entire landscape around them was shifting, becoming a labyrinth of twisting shadows and broken ground. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her chest. It wasn't physical, but deep in her soul. She gasped for breath, clutching at her chest as the pain intensified. It felt like something was tearing at her from the inside, like the darkness was pulling at the very core of her being. "Amy!" Ben shouted, his voice desperate as he reached out to steady her. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with terror. I can't," she gasped, unable to finish the sentence. The pain was overwhelming, and she could feel herself slipping. She didn't know what was happening, but it felt like the darkness was pulling her deeper into itself. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the pain stopped. Amy inhaled sharply, her chest heaving with the sudden relief. But it was only temporary. The ground beneath them cracked open again, and this time a figure appeared before them, emerging from the very shadows that had consumed the town. It was tall and menacing, its body cloaked in darkness. The glowing eyes were the first thing Amy saw, burning bright like twin flames, and as they locked onto her, she felt the same chill run down her spine that she had felt when she first encountered the figure in the house. "You cannot escape me," the figure spoke without moving its lips, its voice a low, guttural growl that reverberated through Amy's chest. It was the same voice that had haunted her, the one that had been with her since the moment she stepped foot in Waverly. Amy wanted to run. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't move. The darkness was all around her, pressing against her skin, binding her, holding her in place. She felt like she was drowning in it, the weight of it crushing her, stealing the very air from her lungs. Ben, they tried to move forward, his eyes wild with fear. "We have to get away," he said, but his voice trembled, and the fear in his eyes mirrored Amy's. But the figure only took one slow, deliberate step forward, and Amy felt a coldness ripple through her body, paralyzing her with fear. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The air around her seemed to grow thicker with each passing second, and she could hear the whispers now. Too many voices, all speaking at once, all coming from the darkness, all calling to her, urging her to give in. You belong to me. Amy's vision blurred as she felt the pull of the darkness. It was dragging her in, pulling her down into its depths. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She couldn't escape. No matter how hard she tried, she was trapped. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, something inside her snapped. A sudden surge of energy, pure, raw, defiant, exploded within her chest. Amy gasped, her eyes widening as she felt the warmth of her own strength returning. She wasn't just going to let this thing win. She wasn't going to let it take her. With all the strength she had left, she pulled away from the figure's grip on, her mind. She fought against the darkness, pushing it back, trying to break free from its suffocating hold. And for the first time since she had entered Waverly, she felt the shadows recede, pulling away from her like an ancient force that had been beaten back. But the figure did not retreat. It reached forward again, its hands stretching toward her, its eyes blazing with an intensity that made Amy's blood run cold. The darkness around them seemed to swirl, growing stronger, closing, stronger, closing in again. Amy felt the pull again, but this time she fought back harder, her body trembling with the effort. You cannot fight what you cannot see, the figure hissed, its voice dripping with malice. But Amy was determined. She wouldn't give in. She wouldn't let the darkness take her. I won't be yours, she shouted, her voice breaking through the air. I am not part of you. The ground beneath her feet shook again, but this time she stood firm. She held her ground, even as the world around her seemed to twist and warp, the darkness closing in on her like a living thing. The figure in front of her seemed to falter for a moment, its glowing eyes flickering as if it were confused by her resistance. And then, in a final act of defiance, Amy gathered all the strength she could and lunged forward, her body surrounded by a sudden burst of light that pierced through the shadows, shining brighter than she could have imagined. The figure let out a horrible scream as the light engulfed it, its form disintegrating into the darkness like smoke in the wind. The ground shook one last time before everything went silent. Amy collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Her chest heaved as she lay there, her mind reeling from the confrontation, her body exhausted. Ben collapsed beside her, his body shaking, but the terror in his eyes had faded. Is it over? Amy didn't answer right away. She didn't know. The darkness was gone for now, but the town, Waverly, was still there, lurking just out of sight. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly gone, but for now at least. They were free. Amy lay on the cold, cracked ground, her body trembling from the exertion, her mind spinning with everything that had just transpired. She could still feel the weight of the darkness, even though it seemed to have vanished. The air around her was thick with uncertainty, and every sound, no matter how small, echoed loudly in the silence. Ben, still beside her, was breathing heavily, his body weak from the ordeal, but he kept glancing around nervously. The fear wasn't gone, in fact. It felt even more intense, now that the immediate threat had passed. It was like something was still waiting, just beneath the surface. Amy? Is it over? Ben's voice was hoarse, laced with doubt. Amy sat up slowly, her muscles stiff and aching. She looked around at the desolate landscape, the town behind them, the twisted remnants of the place that had once been Waverly, and the darkening sky above. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of the shadows that had plagued them. But there was something in the air, something that didn't sit right with her. I don't know, Amy whispered. her voice barely audible. "I don't feel like audible. It's over." Ben's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw the same uncertainty reflected back at her. They had been running for so long, trapped in the nightmare of Waverly, and now, even though they had fought back, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of something much larger, much older. She stood up shakily, her feet unsteady beneath her. Ben followed her, his hand still gripping hers. "We should get out of here," he said. "We can't out of here," he said. "We can't stay here. We need to find a way back to the real world." Amy didn't respond immediately. Her gaze lingered on the horizon, the twisted ruins of Waverly stretching before her. She knew that leaving was the right thing to do, but part of her couldn't help but wonder if it was even possible. The town had a way of clinging to you, a way of pulling you back, and no matter how far they ran, it felt like Waverly would always be just behind them, lurking in the shadows of their memories. "Amy," Ben said again, his voice urgent. "Please, we need to go." Amy nodded and turned away from the town. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. They had to keep moving. They had to escape whatever hold the town still had on them. But as they walked, the sense of unease didn't leave her. It felt like the ground beneath her feet was shifting again, like the very fabric of reality was beginning to warp and bend. The trees on either side of them creaked in air. The wind, their limbs twisting in unnatural shapes, as if they too were being drawn into the same malevolent force that had claimed the town. And then, out of nowhere, Amy felt it again. That cold, suffocating presence. She stopped dead in it. She stopped dead in it. Her tracks, her heart hammering in her chest. Ben froze beside her, his eyes widening in alarm. He could feel it too. The whispers, they were back. You can never escape. Amy's breath caught in her throat. The voice was faint at first. "Oh, why?" Those was faint at first. Whisper carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. The same voice, the same cold, hollow voice that had haunted them since they first arrived in Waverly. Ben turned to her, his face filled with panic. "What is it? Where is it coming from?" Amy looked around, her eyes darting between the twisted trees, the empty roads, the darkening sky. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of the darkness, but the whispers. Those terrible, insidious whispers were growing louder with each whisper's passing second. "You are mine." Amy squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in the back of her mind. But it was no use. The whispers weren't just around her, they were inside her. She could feel them in her head, in her thoughts, in her very soul. And then it happened. The ground beneath her feet shifted, cracking open once again. The same crack that had opened up before. The same abyss that had threatened to swallow them earlier. It was back, wider and deeper, pulling at the very fabric of reality. Amy stumbled back, her heart racing as the chasm seemed to grow before her eyes. Ben reached out for her, but Amy couldn't move. The whispers had a hold on her, but Amy couldn't move, tugging at her consciousness, and she felt herself being drawn toward the dark void. "No," Amy gasped. "Not again." But the darkness was too strong, and before she could stop herself, her feet moved toward the edge of the chasm. The air around her grew thick, suffocating, and the weight of the presence, the weight of the darkness, pressed down on her, pulling her in. Ben grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Amy! No! You have to fight!" But it was too late. The darkness was already inside her. Amy felt herself being pulled into the void, the chasm widening, stretching open like a gaping mouth, ready to swallow her whole. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by Thea. growing darkness, her voice fading as she was pulled deeper into the abyss. "You belong to me now," the voice whispered again, louder this time, as if it were in her very mind. "Forever." And as the darkness consumed her, Amy realized with a chilling certainty that Waverly hadn't just claimed her. It had marked her. It had bound her to it, to the very heart of its malevolent power, and no matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, she would never be free, because darkness had already taken root inside her. Amy felt the cold pull of the void deeper into her chest as her body was dragged forward, her limbs no longer obeying her. The abyss before her seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing everything in its path. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the force was too strong, like it was part of her now, woven into the very fabric of her being. The voice of the darkness echoed in her mind again, filling her thoughts with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You can never leave. You belong to me. Forever." Her heartbeat raced in her chest, but the fear was beginning to dull, like it was slowly being replaced with something darker, something she couldn't control. She could feel it deep inside her, crawling under her skin, wrapping around her very soul. The pull of the darkness intensified, dragging her further. Amy's vision blurred as the edges of the world seemed to dissolve around her. The shadows consumed everything. And, in that moment, she wondered if she would ever see Ben again. She thought of him, the last shred of hope she had, but just as the darkness threatened to swallow her entirely, a sharp tug pulled her back, wrist, his eyes wild with fear. "Amy, don't let it take you. You have to fight." For a moment, it felt like she was torn between two worlds, the suffocating embrace of the void and the warmth of Ben's touch. Amy's mind screamed, her instincts fighting against the pull of the darkness. She could feel the cold, wet tendrils of the abyss wrapping around her, dragging her deeper into its depths. But Ben's voice reached her, breaking through the fog of fear that clouded her thoughts. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Amy forced herself to breathe, to focus. She reached out, grasping Ben's hand tightly, and with one final burst of energy, she yanked herself away from the pull of the darkness. "Amy!" Ben cried out, his voice filled with panic, but she could hear the faintest edge of hope in his words. Together, they stumbled back from the chasm, the darkness swirling around them like an angry beast, its cold fingers reaching for them. The figure, the one with the glowing eyes, was back, standing just beyond the chasm, its form more solid, more real than ever. It was towering, monstrous, its shape warping and flickering with every movement, like a nightmare made flesh. The figure raised one long, bony arm, pointing directly at Amy and Ben, its glowing eyes narrowing as it did. "You cannot escape me," it whispered, its voice deep and distorted, like the sound of 1,000 lost souls crying out in agony. Amy shuddered, but she refused to let it break her. She tightened her grip on Ben's hand, her body shaking with fear, but her mind clear for the first time since they'd entered the town. "We're not running anymore," she whispered, more to herself. Then to Ben, "We face this together." Ben nodded, though his face was pale with fear, his expression filled with doubt. "But how? How do we fight it?" Amy's gaze shifted to the figure, still standing at the edge of the chasm, its glowing eyes burning with malevolent intent. The shadows around them grew darker, and the air thickened with an overwhelming pressure. But Amy knew that the only way to be free was to destroy the thing that had been haunting them. "We end it here," she said, her voice steady, filled with a newfound resolve. Amy pulled Ben closer, and for the first time, she didn't feel fear, but a strange sense of purpose. She had fought to survive, she had fought to escape. But now, she wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was fighting to end the nightmare. She looked around, and though the shadows seemed to press closer, she noticed something. The light was coming back, faint at first, but growing brighter, illuminating the darkness around them. The more she focused on it, the brighter it became. The air around her grew warmer, and the ground beneath her feet felt solid. Once again, the light was fighting the shadows, pushing back against the figure, the darkness that had gripped them both. Amy stepped forward, feeling the light grow stronger with each movement. It was her power, the power of resistance, of survival. She could feel it building inside her, pushing against the suffocating force of the figure, the darkness, the town. The figure hissed, its form flickering and warping as it tried to resist the light. "You cannot defeat me. You are already mine." But Amy wasn't listening anymore. She stepped forward again, her hand stretched out toward the figure, her voice steady and determined. "We are not yours," she said, her voice echoing in the still air. "We never were." The light around her flared brightly, blinding her for a moment, and then everything changed. The figure shrieked, its form disintegrating as the light surged forward. It tried to fight, but it was too late. The darkness, the force that had controlled everything, began to unravel. The walls that had kept them trapped, the shadows that had consumed them, all of it started to fade, retreating into nothingness. Amy closed her eyes against the blinding light, but she didn't stop. She didn't let up. She could feel the presence of the figure slipping away, its grip on her, on them, weakening, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light faded, leaving only silence behind. Amy opened her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the town of Waverly was still. The whispers had stopped. The darkness was gone. There were no figures, no twisted shadows, no malevolent presence lingering in the corners of the world. She and Ben stood alone in the quiet, empty town. It was over. But even as she breathed in the cool night air, Amy couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly gone. The darkness had been banished. For now. But the power it held was something ancient. For now. But the power it held. Something that would always remain, waiting for the right moment to return. And no matter how far she ran, no matter how much she tried to escape, she would always be aware of it. It would always be there, waiting. Amy and Ben stood in the silent aftermath of their battle with the darkness. The world around them felt still, unnaturally quiet, as if the very air had stopped moving, holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The absence of the suffocating weight that had pressed down on them for so long was almost overwhelming. The shadows had retreated, and for the first time, Amy felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. But even in this moment of calm, Amy knew deep down that it wasn't over. Feeling that something was still watching them lingered in the air, just beneath the surface. She couldn't shake it. The town, the place that had trapped them, had let them go. For now, but the darkness that had been woven into the very fabric of Waverly still lingered, like a ghost haunting the edges of her thoughts. "Do you think it's really over?" Ben asked, his voice small, unsure. Amy looked over at him. He had been so strong for her, holding on to her through every terrifying moment. But now, he seemed to share the same doubts she had been battling. The shadows, the whispers, they had all been so real. But this stillness was something new, something they had never felt before. "I don't know," Amy answered quietly, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "But I don't think we can trust that it's truly gone. Something this powerful, doesn't just disappear. Ben's face darkened, his shoulders slumping with the weight of their ordeal. What if it comes back? What if it's waiting for us to let our guard down? Amy didn't have an answer. She didn't know what was next for them. She had no idea if the town would ever fully release its grip on them. The only thing she was certain of was that they couldn't stay here. Not in Waverly, not in this place of dark memories. She turned away from the distant ruins of the town, focusing instead on the path ahead. The night was quiet now, but the world still felt wrong. Every creaking tree, every gust of wind, felt like a warning. The oppressive wind, silence that had taken over the town, still hung in the air, like the calm before a storm. "We need to get as far away from here as possible," Amy said, more to herself than to Ben. "This place, it's not finished with us." Ben nodded. "His place. It's not finished with us?" Ben nodded. "His place?" Eyes distant, but he didn't argue. They had walked far enough to be out of sight of the decaying town, but Amy still felt like they hadn't left it behind. The earth beneath their feet still felt heavy, as if it were dragging them back. She could feel the presence of the darkness in the distance, a faint pull tugging at her, urging her to turn back, to face what had been left behind. Ben reached for her hand, his grip reassuring, but Amy didn't let it comfort her. She wasn't sure if they had truly escaped, if they were truly free. She didn't know if they ever could be. Hours passed as they continued walking, the world around them slowly changing as they put more distance between themselves and Waverly. The road, a road distance between themselves and Waverly, stretched on endlessly, the cold night air biting into their skin, but the oppressive silence began to ease. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie, pale light on the path ahead. But Amy didn't feel safe. "Not yet. We need to find somewhere to rest," Ben said quietly. Breaking the silence, Amy nodded, but she didn't answer. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly alone, that something was still watching them. The air around her seemed to hum with them. The air around her seemed to hum with tension, and every rustle of leaves, every snap of twigs beneath their feet, felt like a warning. She turned to Ben. Her eyes meeting. "Do you hear that?" Ben stopped, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Hear what?" Amy strained her ears, trying to make sense of the sound in the distance. It was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but it was unmistakable, a soft whisper, like voices calling from just beyond the trees. She could feel the hairs on the back waist of her neck standing on end as the whispers grew louder. "You can't escape?" Ben turned toward the sound, his eyes widening. "What is that? Is it—" Before he could finish, a figure appeared in the distance. It wasn't a person, not really. It was more like a shadow, tall and thin, almost fluid in its movement. Shifting in and out of sight, it was cloaked in darkness, its form, it was undulating like smoke. Amy froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure's eyes glowed with a cold, malevolent light, the same glow that had haunted her in Waverly. It didn't move toward them. It didn't move toward them. It didn't need to. It was already right there, its presence closing in on them, suffocating, consuming. "You thought you could leave," it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. But the darkness never lets go. Amy took a step back, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She could feel the weight of its gaze, the crushing force of its will, pressing down on her like the walls of a tomb. Ben's grip tightened around her hand, and Amy turned to him, her face pale with fear. "We can't outrun it, can we?" The figure's glowing eyes narrowed, its smile widening, as if it had been waiting for them to realize that there was no escape. "No," Amy said, her voice trembling. "No matter what we do, it will follow. It's already due." It will follow inside of us. And then the figure spoke again, its voice colder than ever, sending a chill through Amy's entire being. You are mine. The darkness surged forward, the shadows swallowing everything around them. The world around them seemed to shudder, the very air crackling with energy. It wasn't just the town that was cursed. It was them. Amy and Ben were trapped, and there was no escaping what had claimed them. The darkness surged closer, its presence overwhelming, pressing down on Amy and Ben like an unrelenting force. The figure, still cloaked in shadows, seemed to stretch and twist with every passing second, its eyes cold and burning with a malevolent glow, bored into Amy, as though it was peeling back her very soul. Amy felt the weight of its gaze, but she couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were frozen in place, her mind screaming for her to run, to fight, but the darkness held her in a vice-like grip. Ben, too, was paralyzed beside her, his body rigid with fear, his eyes wide in terror. You cannot escape, the figure whispered again, the words sliding into her mind like poison. You were always meant to be mine. Amy's heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in her chest, the sound deafening in her chest. Ears. The figure's form flickered, changing shape, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. At one moment, it was a monstrous, towering figure. The next, it was a shapeless void, shifting in and out of existence. But one thing remained constant. The suffocating pull of its presence. Ben stumbled forward, trying to break free from the darkness that had encircled them. Amy, we have to run. Amy grabbed his arm, her breath shallow, her body shaking with terror. It's no use, she whispered. There's nowhere to run. Ben looked at her with wide eyes, his face filled with confusion and desperation. What do you mean? We can't just stay here. But Amy could feel it. The ground beneath their feet had already begun to shift, crumbling and warping with each breath. The figure wasn't just a shadow. It was a manifestation of the land itself, of the town and the evil that had taken root here. No matter how far they ran, no matter how hard they tried to escape, it would always pull them back. It had already marked them. And the worst part was, Amy had started to realize that the figure wasn't just after her. It was after both of them. It wanted them both, their souls entwined with the dark forces that controlled Waverly. The figure's voice echoed again, louder this time. You cannot hide from the truth. You were always meant to be part of me. Amy closed her eyes, the weight of its words crashing over her. She tried to fight it, tried to push back against the force that was draining the life from her, but it was too strong. The air around them felt thick and suffocating, and Amy felt her breath become suffocating, and Amy felt her breath become shallow, her body growing weak under the pressure. Ben turned to her, panic in his eyes. Amy, we have to do something. We can't just give up. But Amy didn't know what else to do. The light that had saved them before, felt like a distant memory. The figure had stolen everything. Their hope, their safety, their sense of freedom. It was as if they were no longer living in the fell world they had known. They were trapped in a nightmare, and there was no waking up. Then, as if on cue, the world around them seemed to twist and bend, like a dream that was coming apart at the seams. The ground split open again, revealing a deep, dark abyss that seemed to stretch into infinity. The sky above them darkened, swirling with black clouds, and the figure stepped forward, its form growing more solid with each passing second. You belong to me, it hissed. The words cut through the air like a blade. There is no escape. There never was. Amy's heart raced. She could feel the darkness pulling at her, the air around her growing colder, and the shadows reaching out like hands, grabbing at her legs, pulling her legs, pulling her legs. Down, she gasped, trying to break free, but the shadows were stronger than ever. They weren't just physical, they were inside her, inside Ben, and there was no way out. But then, amidst the overwhelming terror, a strange thought crossed her mind. What if the answer wasn't fighting it? What if the way to escape wasn't through strength, but through understanding? She remembered something, a flicker of a memory, a faint whisper from deep within her mind. The light that had shown her the truth, the light that had given her hope. She had felt it before. The light wasn't just a force to fight against the darkness. It was a force to transform it. Her eyes widened with realization. Ben, she gasped. We don't need to fight it. We need to become it. Ben turned to her, confusion spreading across his face. What are you talking about? We can't become part of it. We have to destroy it. Amy shook her head. No, we can't destroy it. We can't outrun it, but maybe, just maybe, we can transform it. Turn it into something else. Something that doesn't have control over us anymore. Ben hesitated, his eyes scanning the swirling shadows around them. The figure had stopped moving, watching them with cold, burning eyes, as if it was waiting for them to make their next move. We can't just let it consume us, Ben said, but his voice wasn't as sure as before. He was starting to understand. The desperation in his voice was giving way to something else. Doubt, but also a strange curiosity. Amy stepped forward, her body shaking, but her mind clear. Wait, what? Have to stop seeing it as the enemy. We have to accept it. Only then can we break free. We don't need to be afraid anymore. Ben didn't answer right away, but Amy could see the doubt in his eyes. She could see him struggling with the same fears, the same thoughts that had plagued her. But she also saw something else, a glimmer of understanding. The figure moved again, but this time it didn't advance toward them. Instead, it stopped just short of where they stood. Its glowing eyes flickered once, twice, before it tilted its head slightly, as if considering Amy's words. For a moment, everything was still, and then, without warning, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble once more. The darkness seemed to tremble once more, pull back, shrinking, retreating into the shadows. Amy took a deep breath, feeling the pull of the darkness begin to wane. Slowly, she reached out toward the figure, her hand trembling, but her voice steady. We don't have to be enemies anymore, she said softly. You don't have to control us. We can find peace. For a long moment, the figure remained still, its glowing eyes studying her. Then, with a final deafening scream, the darkness began to break apart. The ground shook as the shadows twisted and warped. But this time, they weren't closing in on her. They were disappearing. And in that moment, Amy realized something she hadn't understood before. The darkness wasn't just something to escape. It was something to accept and transform. She wasn't bound by it. She never had been. As the last remnants of the figure dissolved into the wind, the sun began to rise over the horizon. The air was warmer now, the sky clear. The world felt like it had been reborn, free from the grip of the nightmare that had held it. Amy looked at Ben, a smile slowly creeping onto her face. They had done it. They had broken free. But deep down, she knew that the darkness wasn't gone for good. It would always be there, lurking in the corners of their minds, waiting for the right moment to return. But for now, they were free. And that was enough. As the sunlight slowly spread across the horizon, the world around Amy and Ben seemed to breathe again. The suffocating darkness, the heavy weight that had plagued their every step, was now gone, dissolved by the light they had summoned. The town of Waverly, though still standing, felt different, almost like it had been exorcised of the malevolent force that had once taken root in its very bones. But Amy couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. She glanced over at Ben, his face tired but relieved, as if he had been holding his breath for far too long. The fierce tension had drained from his posture, but his eyes still reflected the fear they had lived through. "Amy," Ben said, his voice softer than it had been in days. "Do you think it's really over?" Amy didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. There was something still lingering in the back of her mind, a gnawing sense of unfinished business. Something told her that Waverly, and the darkness within it, wouldn't simply fade away. It had simply faded away, been so deeply ingrained in their lives, like a poison that had seeped into their souls. Could they truly be free? Or had they just temporarily silenced it? The wind kicked up again, rustling through the trees. The once oppressive silence had lifted, replaced by the soft whisper of the natural world. Birds chirping, leaves rustling. But Amy's thoughts were too heavy, too clouded with doubt to fully embrace the calm. The whispers of the past seemed to linger in the corners of her mind, faint but persistent. "I don't know," Amy admitted, her voice quiet. "I really want to believe it's over, but I don't think we can ever truly leave it behind. It's not just Waverly. The darkness. It's inside us now. It's a part of us." Ben looked at her, his expression shifting between confusion and understanding. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, Thea opened his mouth to speak. Air around them seemed to grow colder. Just for a moment, Amy's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to look to know that the feeling was unmistakable. The same chill she had felt just before the shadows had taken hold of them. Just before the shadows had taken hold of them. Just before the darkness had begun to rise again. Ben noticed too. His hand instinctively reached for hers. "Amy, do you feel that?" "I do," she said, her heart pounding. She felt it too. The air had changed, shifting from warm to a sudden, sharp cold. The wind seemed to stop, as if it had been stilled by an invisible hand. And then they heard it. Faint at first, a peace at first, whisper carried on the wind. Barely audible. "You cannot run forever." Amy froze, her entire body going rigid. Ben looked at her, his face drained of color. The voice, that voice, it was unmistakable. The darkness was not finished. "Ben, we did have to go now," Amy said, her voice urgent. She turned, pulling him toward the edge of the town, away from the familiar streets that had once been their home. They couldn't linger here, not now, not after everything they had been through. But just as they started to move, the ground beneath their feet trembled. The earth cracked open, just like before, but this time, it wasn't just one chasm. It was multiple cracks spreading through the ground, each one pulsing with an unnatural energy. "You think you've won," the voice whispered again, its tone full of malice, "but you are part of me now, and you will always return." Amy's breath hitched as the cracks in the earth began to widen, pulling the very landscape apart. The sky above them, once bright and clear, began to darken, swirling with black clouds. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, howling around them like a tempest. "Amy, we need to move, now," Ben shouted, pulling her faster. They ran, their feet pounding against the ground, but the darkness was closing in. It was everywhere now, hovering in the air like a suffocating fog, surrounding them from all sides. Suddenly, they heard a loud crack, like thunder. They both looked up to see a massive tree just ahead of them, its roots violently ripping free from the earth. The tree's bark twisted and cracked, as though it were alive, growing and warping under some unseen force. The air around it shimmered with the same energy that had consumed Waverly, and Amy's heart sank as she realized. The darkness wasn't just trying to take them, it was trying to reclaim them. "Ben, no!" Amy screamed, but it was too late. The tree's branches shot out like claws, snaring Ben by the arm and yanking him off his feet. He cried out in pain, the branches tightening around him, pulling him toward the darkening sky. "Ben!" Amy's voice cracked as she tried to run to him, but the ground beneath her feet gave way, sending her tumbling into the chasm that had opened up. Her hand scraped against the dirt as she struggled to catch herself, but the pull of the darkness was too strong. She could feel it, sinking into her skin, crawling under her nails. She reached for Ben, but the tree had already drawn him into its twisting branches. His screams echoed around her, but she couldn't reach him. The darkness was too thick. She was being swallowed by it again. "You belong to me," the voice said, softer this time, almost as if it were soothing her. "You are mine. Forever." Amy's vision began to blur, the weight of the darkness pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. But then, through the suffocating fog, something else pierced the dark. A flicker of light. It was faint at first, like the faintest star in a sky full of clouds, but it was real, the same light she had felt before. When they had faced the figure, she reached for it. Desperate to pull herself free, she fought against the pull of the darkness, her hands shaking as she reached out for the light, her fingers grazing it. And then, in a moment of pure clarity, the light surged, pushing back the darkness with a force so powerful that the very air seemed to crack with its intensity. Amy's body shuddered as the light wrapped around her, pulling her back from the abyss, from the very depths of the nightmare. And then, with a final surge, the light tore the darkness apart. Amy's chest heaved as she stood, the light enveloping her in a warm, protective glow. The darkness had receded, but the air around her still felt charged. Heavy air around her still felt charged, heavy with the weight of what they had just escaped. She couldn't help but feel that the battle wasn't over, that the darkness was still lurking, waiting for its moment to strike again. Ben was still caught in the grasp of the tree, struggling against the tree. Its tight grip, his body was battered, but he was alive. That was all that mattered right now. Amy's heart raced as she reached out to him, her fingers trembling as she pushed herself forward, determined not to lose him. The light around her flickered for a moment, but it didn't die. Instead, it pulsed stronger, as if it recognized her desperation. Amy reached out with her hand, feeling the warmth grow as the light responded to her need. She took another step, closing the distance between herself and Ben. The tree's roots had retreated somewhat, as though the light was forcing it back, but it still held on to him tightly. She could see the fear in Ben's eyes as he struggled to free himself, his body weak from battle. His strength was fading, and Amy knew time was running out. "Ben," she shouted, her voice cracking as she reached for him. Ben's gaze locked with hers, his lips parting in an attempt to speak, but no sound came out. Amy's heart sank at the look in his eyes. Desperation, exhaustion, and an overwhelming sense of defeat. She couldn't let him fall. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Not after all the sacrifices. With renewed determination, Amy stepped forward again, feeling the power of the light intensify with every movement. It was guiding her now, pushing her forward. She didn't have time to think. She just had to act. She reached out, her fingers grazing the bark of the tree. At first, nothing happened, but then the light surged, flowing from her into the tree, the warmth spreading through its gnarled branches. For a brief moment, the tree seemed to recoil, as though it couldn't handle the force of the light, and then, with a loud crack, the tree's branches split open, releasing Ben. Amy caught him just in time, her arms wrapping around him as he collapsed into her. His body was shaking, but he was alive. They were alive, Are you okay? Amy whispered, her voice full of relief and concern. Ben nodded weakly, his breath shallow. I think so, but I don't know for how long. Amy's eyes darted around them. The town, once filled with oppressive shadows, was now eerily yet silent. The figure, the darkness, the force that had controlled everything. They were gone, for now. But Amy could still feel the remnants of their presence lingering in the air. The town might have fallen silent, but she knew it wasn't truly at peace. We need to leave, Amy said, her voice firm. She helped Ben to his feet, keeping him steady as they began to move away from the tree. The ground beneath them still felt unstable, but the light around them seemed to protect them, to keep the darkness at bay as they walked. The quiet continued to press in around them. There were no more whispers, no more signs of the darkness, but Amy couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. The silence was unnerving, and the weight of the town seemed to follow them, like a cloud on the horizon. Where do we go now? Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. Amy didn't know how to answer. She wasn't sure where they could go, but she knew one thing. They couldn't stay here. Waverly wasn't safe. It never had been. They had escaped the darkness, but they had escaped the darkness, but they had escaped the darkness. Only scratched the surface of what lay beneath. The town had a way of pulling people in, of trapping them, and no matter how far they ran, no matter how hard they tried to escape, Waverly would always find a way to bring them back. But Amy wasn't going to let that happen. Not again. We leave Waverly, she said, her voice steady, though her mind raced. We get as far from here as we can, whatever's left of this place. We can stay, we have to move on, Ben nodded, his grip tightening on her as they walked together, further and further away from the decaying remnants of the town. With each step, Amy felt the weight of the past lifting, but only slightly. The shadows still lingered in the corners of her mind, like ghosts that refused to be exorcised. And then, as they reached the edge of the town, Amy paused. Something in the distance caught her attention. A flicker of movement. She squinted, trying to make sense of it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the movement vanished. Did you see that? She asked Ben, her heart racing. Ben turned, his face filled with confusion. What? Oh, I don't know, Amy murmured, shaking her head. But I saw something in the trees. Ben stepped forward, his expression wary. It could be nothing. Let's just keep moving. Amy hesitated. She didn't want to turn back. She didn't want to turn back, face whatever it was that still lurked in the shadows of Waverly. But the uneasy feeling in her gut told her they weren't truly free yet. There was something unfinished, something still waiting for them. For a moment, they stood in silence, the faint breeze rustling the trees around them, and then, once again, Amy felt that pull. The one she had felt back in the town, when she had tried to run. It was subtle, but it was there, drawing her back toward the center of the town. But this time, Amy wasn't going back. She turned to Ben, her voice firm. Let's go. We're not turning back. And together they walked away, their footsteps steady but their hearts still heavy with the knowledge that Waverly might never let them go. It had already left its mark on them, etched into their souls, and no matter how far they ran, no matter where they went, it would always follow. And one day, when the darkness returned, they would have to face it once again. Amy and Ben walked for what felt like hours, the quiet of the world surrounding them, pressing in on them with every step they took. The weight of everything that had happened, the terror, the darkness, still clung to them like a thick fog. And no matter how far they walked, it felt like the shadows of Waverly were still following them, just out of reach. Amy's mind raced as she glanced over at Ben. He had remained quiet for most of the journey, his face pale and drawn, his eyes distant. His face pale and drawn. His eyes distant, had been through just as much as she had, and she could see the toll it had taken on him. The exhaustion, the fear. It was all there, buried beneath the surface. But still, there was something else. Something she couldn't quite place. It was something she couldn't quite place. It was like a hollow emptiness in his eyes. "We can't keep running," Amy said softly, breaking the silence. "I don't know what to do anymore." Ben glanced at her. His lips parted as though he wanted to say something, but no words came. He took a deep breath, and for a moment they walked side by side, just trying to get as far away from the darkness as possible. The sun had long since set, and the night sky was thick with stars, but even the beauty of the sky couldn't chase away the chill in the air. The breeze carried an eerie stillness, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The feeling of unease grew with every step, and Amy could feel it deep in her bones. "Ben," she began again, her voice hesitant. "Do you think we'll ever really be free of it? Waverly, the darkness, will we ever truly escape?" Ben stopped walking and turned to her, his face filled with an emotion she couldn't name. He stepped closer, and for a brief moment, it was as though everything was still. "I don't know," Ben said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought we could outrun it. I thought if we left, if we just got far enough away, we could be free. But now, I don't know anymore." Amy's heart sank at his words. She had felt the same way. The darkness, the fear, it was always there, just beneath the surface. It had become a part of them, and no matter how far they ran, it seemed to be following them, lingering like a shadow they couldn't shake off. Ben reached out to touch her arm, his grip gentle, but there was a sense of urgency in his touch. "We have to face it, Amy. We can't keep running. The darkness is a part of us now, and if we don't confront it, it will never let us go." Amy looked into his eyes, seeing the same realization reflected there. She had known this for a while, but hearing it out loud made it feel all the more real. They couldn't outrun it. They couldn't keep hiding. The darkness would always be there, waiting, following them wherever they went. She took a deep breath, her mind made up. "We go back?" Ben's eyes widened. "Back to Waverly?" Amy nodded slowly. "We have to face it. We can't keep running from something that's already inside us." The decision weighed heavily on her, but it was the only choice they had left. She wasn't sure what they would find when they returned, but she knew that they had to confront whatever it was that had taken hold of them. If they didn't, they would never be free, together. They turned back toward the town. The road ahead seemed endless, and the night stretched on, dark and heavy, but there was something strangely comforting in the silence between them now. They had both accepted that they couldn't escape what had been done. Now, it was time to face it. As they approached the outskirts of Waverly, the air grew colder, and the eerie silence returned. The buildings that had once felt oppressive now stood like empty shells, silent and lifeless. The streets were still, and the darkness hung in the air like a fog. But there was no sign of the figure, the shadows. For a moment, Amy felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had finally broken free. But as she stepped forward, a cold gust of wind swept through the streets, and she felt the familiar presence, the presence of something watching them, waiting. The darkness was still there, lingering in the shadows, and then, from the distance, she heard it, the same whisper that had haunted them since the beginning. "You can never leave!" The ground beneath their feet trembled once more, and the town seemed to come alive, shifting and warping, like it had been waiting for them. The air was thick with tension, and the sky above them seemed to darken, swirling with an unnatural energy. Amy's heart raced as she turned to Ben, who was staring ahead, his face filled with fear and resignation. They had come back. But what had they come back to? The figure appeared then, not as a distant shadow, but fully formed, standing in front of them. Its glowing eyes were filled with malice, its form flickering like it was made of smoke and shadow. "You will never be free," it whispered again, its voice like ice on her skin. Amy clenched her fists, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she stood her ground. Enough from them. She wasn't going to let it take anything more. "We are not yours," Amy said, her voice stronger now, filled with a defiance she hadn't felt before. "We are not part of you," the figure hissed, its form flickering as if the words had struck it. "You think you can break free?" it sneered. "You are mine. You always have been." But Amy's resolve only strengthened. She stepped forward, pushing against the fear that tried to take root in her chest. "No, we're not yours. We'll never be yours." Ben stepped beside her, his hand gripping hers. Together, they stood against the darkness, against the thing that had haunted them for so long, and in that moment, Amy knew they would face whatever came next. They were no longer running. They would fight, and they'd fight, would win.